cold, dark red splash of a $400 vintage Bordeaux hitting a crisp white dress shirt is a sound that Kendrick Thorne will never forget. It was a Tuesday evening inside the private, velvet-draped dining room of Elora, the most exclusive and impossibly expensive restaurant in the financial district of Chicago. The room was softly lit by crystal chandeliers. The air smelled of expensive truffles, roasted duck, and the electric, intoxicating scent of massive corporate greed. Sitting around the expansive mahogany table were the senior partners of Meridian Capital, an aggressive investment firm. And sitting at the absolute center of attention was Vanessa. Vanessa was Kendrick's wife. She was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored emerald green evening gown. Her hair was perfectly swept back. Her eyes were gleaming with the manic, euphoric energy of a woman who was exactly 10 minutes away from signing a $500 million acquisition deal. It was the crowning achievement of her entire life. It was a deal that would net her a $7 million personal commission. And sitting silently next to her, wearing a modest, off-the-rack gray suit, was Kendrick. Throughout the entire dinner, Vanessa had treated her husband as if he were an embarrassing, unwanted intern she had been forced to babysit. She had rolled her eyes when he ordered. She had actively interrupted him every time he tried to speak to her colleagues. But the sheer, unfiltered disrespect reached its catastrophic peak when Kendrick politely leaned forward to ask a question about the contract logistics. Vanessa did not just shush him. She turned to him, her face twisting into a mask of pure, condescending venom. She picked up her crystal wine glass, filled to the brim with vintage red wine, and deliberately, methodically tipped it directly over Kendrick's lap. The dark red liquid soaked instantly into his trousers and his white shirt. The table of wealthy executives fell dead silent. "Oops," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with venomous sarcasm, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "My hand slipped. Kendrick, why don't you go to the restroom and clean yourself up? The adults are about to talk business, and you are completely out of your depth." Sitting across the table, Donovan Pierce, Vanessa's remarkably handsome, incredibly arrogant managing partner, let out a quiet, mocking laugh. He looked at Kendrick with the supreme pity reserved for a pathetic, beaten dog. Kendrick looked down at the dark red stain spreading across his clothes. He felt the cold wine soaking into his skin. He looked up at his wife. He saw the sheer, unadulterated vanity in her eyes. He saw a woman who believed her new tax bracket made her a god. Kendrick did not yell. He did not jump up from the table. He did not cause a chaotic scene. Instead, he slowly picked up a white linen napkin, dabbed calmly at his shirt, and let out a soft, genuine chuckle. Vanessa's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She thought the humiliation had finally broken his mind. But Kendrick wasn't laughing out of grief. He was laughing because Vanessa was absolutely right about one thing: the adults were indeed about to talk business. She just didn't realize that she was not one of the adults. Vanessa thought she was 10 minutes away from securing a $500 million contract from a mysterious, untouchable corporate conglomerate known as Aegis Omnicom. She thought she was about to secure her future with Donovan, the man she had secretly been sleeping with for 6 months. She had absolutely no idea that the boring, underachieving husband sitting next to her with wine on his shirt was the sole founder, majority shareholder, and ultimate CEO of Aegis Omnicom. Vanessa thought she was publicly humiliating her husband. She didn't know she was actively drowning her own career, her reputation, and her entire future in a glass of vintage Bordeaux. To fully comprehend the spectacular, nuclear devastation of Vanessa's impending downfall, one must understand the carefully constructed illusion of Kendrick Thorne. Kendrick was not born into wealth. He grew up in a modest, working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. He was a quiet, intensely brilliant child who spent his teenage years coding complex algorithms and studying global supply chain logistics while his peers were playing video games. By the time he was 25, Kendrick had quietly developed a revolutionary predictive shipping software that completely disrupted the commercial logistics industry. He sold his first patent for $20 million. By age 30, he had parlayed that money into a massive, shadowy empire of tech and supply chain subsidiaries under the umbrella of Aegis Omnicom. But Kendrick was acutely, painfully aware of how extreme wealth mutated the people around him. He had watched friends turn into sycophants. He had watched women date his bank account rather than his soul. So, when his wealth reached the stratosphere, Kendrick did something highly unusual. He erased himself from the public narrative. He appointed a brilliant, fiercely loyal proxy named Xavier Dupont to act as the public-facing CEO of Aegis Omnicom. Kendrick stepped back into the shadows. He drove a modest 3-year-old sedan. He bought a comfortable but completely unremarkable 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. To the outside world, Kendrick Thorne was simply a mid-level data analyst making about $85,000 a year. It was during this carefully orchestrated period of undercover normalcy that he met Vanessa. Vanessa was a junior financial analyst at the time. She was sharp, stunningly beautiful, and incredibly driven. When they first started dating, she didn't care that Kendrick drove a boring car or wore off-the-rack clothes. She seemed to love him for his calm demeanor, his intellect, and his unwavering support of her massive ambitions. They fell in love. They got married in a beautiful, modest ceremony. Kendrick thought he had found the Holy Grail, a woman who loved the man, not the empire. He had fully intended to wait for their 5th wedding anniversary to reveal his true identity. He wanted to surprise her with the world. But as the years passed, the toxic, high-pressure environment of the corporate finance world began to slowly, aggressively poison Vanessa's soul. 3 years into their marriage, Vanessa caught a massive break. She was recruited by Meridian Capital, a cutthroat, elite investment firm known for its ruthless corporate culture. The environment at Meridian was a shark tank fueled by extreme ego, luxury, and relentless greed. The senior partners drove imported sports cars, wore bespoke Italian suits, and measured a human being's worth strictly by their zip code and the balance of their offshore accounts. Vanessa desperately wanted to fit into this new, glittering world. And as her salary rapidly increased from $90,000 to over $300,000, her character violently deteriorated. The transformation was chilling. She stopped coming home for dinner. She started maxing out her credit cards to buy incredibly expensive designer bags and shoes, terrified of looking poor next to the wives of the senior partners. And inevitably, she began to look at her husband with deep, undisguised contempt. Kendrick would come home from his data analyst job, eager to spend time with his wife, but Vanessa would look at him as if he were a stain on the rug. "Why don't you try harder, Kendrick?" She would snap, glaring at his comfortable sweater as she paced the kitchen in her $1,000 heels. "Look at the men at my firm. They are acquiring companies. They are building legacies. And you are perfectly content sitting in a cubicle crunching numbers for pennies. It's embarrassing." Kendrick would just smile tightly, swallowing the bitter irony. He was quietly acquiring international shipping fleets, but he couldn't tell her. He just said, "I like my quiet life, Vanessa. I thought you liked it too." "People outgrow things," she had whispered coldly, and she had certainly outgrown him. Enter Donovan Pierce. Donovan was the newest managing partner at Meridian Capital. He was 35, classically handsome, fiercely arrogant, and came from old, established money. He treated the world like his personal playground, and he treated women like disposable accessories. He immediately set his sights on Vanessa. Donovan fed Vanessa's massive, fragile ego exactly what it craved. He took her to expensive, 3-hour lunches. He told her she was a visionary. He told her she was far too brilliant and far too beautiful to be anchored down by a mediocre husband who lacked the killer instinct. The affair began exactly 8 months before the fateful dinner. Kendrick Thorne was a man who built a multi-billion-dollar tech empire based on data analysis and pattern recognition. Discovering that his wife was sleeping with her boss was tragically, almost insultingly easy. It started with the subtle behavioral shifts. The sudden, obsessive guarding of her cell phone. The emergency weekend strategy meetings at luxury hotels downtown. The heavy, lingering scent of expensive men's cologne on her clothes when she returned home. But Kendrick did not rely on intuition. He relied on data. One Sunday morning, while Vanessa was in the shower, her synced iPad pinged on the kitchen counter. Kendrick walked over to silence it, but the notification banner was fully visible. It was an iMessage from Donovan. "Just secure the Aegis contract on Tuesday. Once your $7 commission hits the account, we serve him the papers. Then, Paris, can't wait to get that dead weight off your back, baby." Kendrick stood perfectly still in his quiet, suburban kitchen. He felt a cold, hollow ache expand rapidly in his chest. He had given this woman his heart. He had been preparing to give her his entire empire. And she was plotting to discard him like a piece of trash the very second her bank account reached a satisfactory level. With surgical precision, Kendrick unlocked the iPad. He didn't need to guess her passcode. It was her wedding anniversary. A date she clearly no longer respected. He spent the next 10 minutes scrolling through 6 months of absolute, heartbreaking betrayal. He read messages where Vanessa mocked his clothes. He read messages where she called him a stepping stone. He read the detailed, calculated plan she had constructed with Donovan to blindside Kendrick with divorce papers immediately following the Aegis Omnicom signing dinner. Kendrick slowly set the iPad back down on the counter. That was the exact moment the last remaining ounce of love in his heart completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculated absolute zero. He didn't confront her when she stepped out of the shower. He didn't scream. He didn't throw her belongings onto the front lawn. Kendrick was a billionaire CEO. He did not throw tantrums. He orchestrated takeovers. He walked into his home office, locked the door, and made a single phone call to Xavier Dupont, his proxy CEO. Xavier, Kendrick said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. Meridian Capital is pitching for the $500 million logistics contract on Tuesday. They are, sir, Xavier replied. Their proposal is solid. We were planning to sign the final authorization at the dinner. Excellent, Kendrick said softly. I want you to demand that Meridian's lead associates bring their spouses to the signing dinner. Tell them it's a required family values optics test for the Aegis board. Make sure Vanessa brings me. Understood, Mr. Thorne, Xavier paused. He knew Kendrick well enough to hear the absolute, terrifying calm in his voice. Is there a specific strategy we are executing at the dinner, sir? Yes, Kendrick replied, his eyes dark and empty. We are executing an absolute massacre. Which brings the story back to the private, velvet-draped dining room at Elora. The tension in the room leading up to the wine-pouring incident had been excruciating. Vanessa had been absolutely furious when Donovan informed her that the Aegis CEO had mandated a spouse's required dinner. She had spent the entire car ride downtown berating Kendrick. Do not speak, she had hissed at him as they pulled up to the valet. Do not try to make jokes. Do not talk about your boring little data job. These men manage billions. Just sit there, eat your steak, and try not to embarrass me. My entire future is riding on the signature tonight. Kendrick had simply nodded, wearing his modest gray suit, playing the part of the obedient, intimidated husband flawlessly. When they arrived in the private dining room, Xavier Dupont was already seated at the head of the table. Xavier was a striking, incredibly intimidating man in his 50s, wearing a bespoke suit that commanded absolute respect. Donovan and Vanessa practically fell over themselves trying to impress Xavier. They laughed too hard at his pleasantries. They bragged aggressively about Meridian Capital's portfolio. Through it all, Xavier politely nodded, but his eyes kept darting to the quiet man in the gray suit sitting next to Vanessa. An hour into the dinner, the massive leather binders containing the $500 million contracts were placed onto the table. The terms are incredibly favorable for Aegis, Donovan said smoothly, flashing his expensive veneers at Xavier. We are ready to revolutionize your logistics network. Vanessa here has spearheaded the entire integration model. She is brilliant. I am sure she is, Xavier said, his tone carefully neutral. It was then that Kendrick politely leaned forward. If I may, Kendrick said quietly. Looking at Section 4, the liability clause regarding international freight loss seems heavily weighted against Aegis. Why would Meridian refuse to shoulder the insurance premiums on maritime shipping? The entire table froze. Donovan's face flushed with immediate anger. How dare this nobody, this pathetic data analyst, speak up during a $500 million negotiation? Vanessa looked like she was going to have a stroke. Her husband, the man she despised, was actively jeopardizing her $7 million commission. She turned to him. The sheer, unfiltered vanity and panic in her eyes took over. Without a single word, she picked up her massive crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux, tipped it completely sideways, and poured it directly over Kendrick's lap. Oops, Vanessa said, her voice a venomous hiss. My hand slipped. Kendrick, why don't you go to the restroom and clean yourself up? The adults are about to talk business, and you are completely out of your depth. Donovan chuckled, a cruel, mocking sound. Kendrick looked down at his ruined clothes. He picked up his napkin. He dabbed the dark red stain, and he laughed. He laughed a deep, genuine, terrifyingly calm laugh. He didn't stand up. He didn't leave the table. Instead, Kendrick dropped the blood-red napkin onto his plate. He looked directly down the length of the massive mahogany table, bypassing his wife, bypassing Donovan, and locked eyes entirely with the intimidating CEO of Aegis Omnicom. Well, Xavier, Kendrick said, his voice suddenly shedding every single ounce of its timid, suburban camouflage. It dropped an octave, ringing with the absolute, undeniable authority of a corporate titan. I think I've seen enough. What is your assessment? The arrogant smiles on Vanessa and Donovan's faces froze. They watched in absolute, paralyzing confusion as Xavier Dupont, the man they had been desperately groveling to all night, immediately stood up from his chair. Xavier did not just stand. He buttoned his suit jacket, stood at absolute attention, and bowed his head slightly toward the man in the wine-stained gray suit. "My assessment, Mr. Thorne," Xavier said, his voice echoing with total reverence, "is that Meridian Capital lacks the basic ethical foundation required to partner with Aegis Omnicom. Their leadership is arrogant, their liability clauses are weak, and their personal conduct is absolutely abhorrent." The silence in the dining room was so absolute it was deafening. You could hear the wax dripping from the candles. Vanessa's jaw literally unhinged. She looked at Xavier. Then she looked at Kendrick. Mr. Thorne." Donovan stammered, his arrogant facade completely shattering. He looked at Xavier in panic. "I'm sorry, what is happening? Why are you talking to him?" "You are speaking to the founder, majority shareholder, and ultimate CEO of Aegis Omnicom," Xavier said coldly, gesturing to Kendrick. "I am merely his proxy. Mr. Thorne owns the empire you have been begging for money all night." Vanessa stopped breathing. The blood completely rushed from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. Her entire reality, everything she believed to be true about the universe, had just been violently inverted. The quiet, boring man she had mocked for his lack of ambition, the man whose clothes she had just intentionally ruined. He was the billionaire. Kendrick slowly stood up. He didn't look like a humiliated husband anymore. Standing there, even with wine soaked into his shirt, he radiated a terrifying, suffocating power. "Vanessa," Kendrick said softly. The sound of his voice made her flinch as if she had been struck. "You told me earlier that people outgrow things. You were right." He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket. He pulled out a crisp, dry manila envelope and tossed it onto the table. It landed directly on top of the $500 million contract. "Those are divorce papers," Kendrick said, his eyes utterly dead. "I had my legal team draft them this morning. You'll be pleased to know that because my wealth was heavily protected in blind trusts prior to our marriage, and because you so desperately insisted on keeping our finances completely separate to protect your own salary, you are legally entitled to absolutely nothing." Vanessa let out a choked, desperate gasp. "Kendrick. Kendrick, wait, please, this is a misunderstanding. I love you." "You love Donovan," Kendrick corrected her smoothly, turning his gaze to the terrified managing partner. "Or, at least, you love his money. And speaking of Donovan." Kendrick looked at the trembling executive. "Donovan, I had my investigative team look into Meridian Capital's recent acquisitions. I found some fascinating irregularities regarding your offshore tax filings. So fascinating, in fact, that I forwarded the entire dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission at 5 o'clock this evening." Donovan's face went from pale to a sickening shade of gray. The SEC? His career wasn't just over, he was looking at federal prison. "Oh, and Donovan," Kendrick added, a brilliant, vicious smile finally appearing on his face. "The Aegis contract is officially dead. I will personally ensure that every single major logistics firm in the country knows exactly why Meridian Capital lost this deal. Your firm will be radioactive by Monday morning." Kendrick buttoned his ruined jacket. "Have a lovely evening, everyone," Kendrick said. "Dinner is on me." He turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the dining room. "Kendrick, no, please." Vanessa screamed, completely abandoning her pride, her vanity, and her dignity in front of the entire restaurant. She scrambled out of her chair, her expensive emerald gown catching on the table. "I'm sorry, I'll do anything. Please, Kendrick." Kendrick did not stop. He did not turn around. He walked out of the restaurant, stepped into the cool Chicago night air, and got into the sleek, black-armored SUV that was waiting for him at the curb. He left his wife sobbing uncontrollably on the floor of a restaurant she could no longer afford, next to a lover who was about to be indicted by the federal government. The immediate fallout was apocalyptic. Because of the massive, catastrophic loss of the $500 million Aegis contract, the senior partners at Meridian Capital demanded an immediate internal investigation. When they discovered that Donovan and Vanessa's personal arrogance and horrific behavior had directly caused the billionaire founder to walk away, the retaliation was swift and merciless. Donovan was immediately fired. 3 days later, federal agents from the SEC raided his downtown office based on the anonymous dossier Kendrick had provided. Donovan's assets were frozen, his reputation was obliterated, and he is currently awaiting trial for wire fraud. Vanessa was also terminated from Meridian Capital, completely stripped of her anticipated $7 million commission. The divorce was finalized in less than 60 days. Because she had aggressively insisted on maintaining entirely separate finances during the marriage, believing she would eventually outearn Kendrick, she walked away with exactly what was in her checking account, which, after her massive credit card bills for designer clothes and luxury bags were tallied, was virtually nothing. When Donovan's money and status evaporated, Vanessa immediately tried to abandon him, realizing he was no longer the golden ticket she had sacrificed her marriage for. But the damage was done. The high-end financial world is incredibly small and incredibly gossipy. She was blacklisted from every major firm in the city. Today, Vanessa is working as a mid-level bookkeeper for a regional auto parts distributor. She lives in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment. She takes the city bus to work, her designer bags long since sold on the internet to pay for her legal fees. She spends her nights staring at the ceiling, forever haunted by the staggering, astronomical empire she threw away because she thought a gray suit meant a man had no ambition. And Kendrick Thorne stopped hiding. With the toxic weight of his marriage finally lifted, he stepped out of the shadows. He officially took the public helm of Aegis Omnicom. He was featured on the cover of Forbes magazine, recognized as one of the most brilliant, ruthless, and powerful tech titans in the modern world. He still doesn't wear flashy designer clothes. He still prefers the quiet logic of data to the loud noise of high society galas. But he sleeps incredibly well at night in his sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking the skyline. Unbothered, wealthy, and completely free. What do you guys think of Kendrick's ultimate revenge? Was the undercover billionaire test a brilliant way to find out his wife's true character, or was it a dangerous game to play from the start? If there is one massive lesson to take away from this story, it is this: never judge a book by its cover and never, ever disrespect the people who support you behind closed doors. You truly never know who is holding the keys to the castle. If you loved this story and want to hear more, be sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. We read every single one. And don't forget to like the video to support the channel. Until next time, stay humble, protect your peace, and always appreciate the people who loved you when you had nothing.